They don't seem to be ruling on the merits in these cases, whether it's mifepristone or the Idaho case, as we have seen, but rather on standing, or in the case of the Idaho emergency abortions, dismissed as improvidently granted. Why?
Yes. Well, the case today, I think, is really a mess of the court's own making. The court granted certiorari before the lower court had had a chance to render judgment on the matter. It's granting certiorari before judgment, which is a fairly unusual thing to do for the court. And so they really decided to rush the case themselves. And then in today's per curiam opinion, the opinion for the court said, oh, that was a mistake, although they didn't really take accountability for that. They said the parties' arguments had shifted a little bit. But Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Barrett, they were clearly in the majority here. But in the separate opinions that we saw written, particularly Justice Jackson, really called out the majority for not, as you noted, taking a decision on the merit. The dissent would have, the conservative dissent would have said that the Idaho law can stand. Justice Jackson would have made clear that the Idaho criminalization of abortion procedures, except when necessary to save the life of the, except when necessary to prevent death of the patient, then she would have said that that violates federal law, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which says that emergency caregivers must provide emergency stabilization care for the health of the patient and not waiting until they are on death's door.
A mess of the court's own making. That's quite a line as we consider the idea then of apparently that this case today from Idaho, the mifepristone case, will all come back around again. But we've got some big ones left in this case, in this term, I should say, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's Monday. We're going to get rulings on January 6 offenders, this obstruction charge, as well as the big one when it comes down to presidential immunity. Is it as simple as everyone says? They're afraid to drop these rulings on a debate day like today and might want to wait till closer to the 4th of July. What's the holdup?
I mean, certainly the court's line is that they put out the opinions when they are ready. The furthest the Chief Justice has been willing to go on the record is to say sometimes they take into account the pressure on the Supreme Court printing office, but they would vehemently deny that they're doing this to avoid dropping it on a debate day. That being said, we know they are human beings. They live in the real world. They have to know that all eyes are on the court. The justices and the court and the issues before it are issues in the presidential campaign, whether they like it or not. It's interesting that abortion is such a central issue in this presidential campaign. And certainly there were some accusations lobbed that the court was kicking the can down the road in today's abortion case because they didn't want to come out and support state criminalization of abortions in these very strict states like Idaho. Also, we have a Texas case coming up that will be before the court again. It's just really a delay. It's not a reprieve so much as, just a delay of the ultimate decision in this case. And so avoiding the merits, could be seen as a political move. I'm sure the justices would deny that. And similarly with the immunity case, this is a case that should have been decided very quickly. The fact that it's taken so long, in essence, might give former President Trump a win through delay, even if he ultimately loses on the merits.
Yeah, just by the timing of this, it would be very difficult, if not outright impossible, to get a trial done before the election in November. That's the immunity case, which we're still waiting on. But Joe mentioned another, the January 6th defendants case, calling into question the Enron doctrine, this issue of obstruction. This is something we spoke about yesterday with Stephanie Murphy, former Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, former member of the House committee that investigated the January 6th attack. And this is what she had to say.
It's not just about the January 6 offenders. It's about the rule of law and the ability for Congress to subpoena and secure information and be able to enforce, and also for the judicial system to be able to call witnesses and things like that. You want to do it for the system, not necessarily for this particular case.
Elizabeth, I'd love for you to weigh in on what kind of precedent the court could be setting here when they ultimately decide this question.
I absolutely agree. It's about the rule of law. It's about whether we have a system that can hold accountable people who have been obstructing not just justice, but obstructing one of the most sacred democratic aspects of our constitutional system, the peaceful transfer of power after the appropriate constitutionally held election. And so I think she's right. This is a very big issue about the rule of law. That's true in the obstruction case, I think perhaps even more so in the immunity case, because that brings us back to the founding principle of our country, really, that no one is above the law. Whether you're the most powerful or the most vulnerable, we equally stand before the scales of justice. And that's one of our, aspirations, one of our most deeply held American values. And that's really at stake in the immunity case in particular.
Our viewers watching Bloomberg TV and YouTube seeing live shots now from the airport in Atlanta as Donald Trump's airplane, known affectionately to some MAGA supporters as Trump Force One, touches down. The former president has made his way down to the tarmac. It is on board now at that black SUV that we're showing you on the screen here. Elizabeth, any thoughts on how the court falls on presidential immunity?
Well, I think certainly the issues themselves raised by the former president should be easily rejected in that sense. But I think the court, as they noted during oral argument, is inclined to try to write something broader. They don't have to. Obviously, the court can very much just look at the case before it and say, on these particular arguments that came before us, we find no merit. We send it back to the trial court to continue proceedings. But they could be trying to write something more complicated that could be causing the delay. But whatever is causing the delay, it certainly is not to the benefit of the American people as we get closer and closer to the presidential election and this massively important issue of whether someone running for president tried to thwart our democracy still has not gone before a court of law as it should. He's been indicted by a grand jury of his peers, and we should have accountability in that way, whichever way the ultimate group of deciders, the jury in that particular case, rules. It would be to the benefit of the American people and democracy if that could happen before the election. And the Supreme Court's delay, however they rule on the merits, has certainly hindered that.